Chole! Now, there was someone at a conference with this last name that spelt this way that they were pronouncing her name as Chole. So who knows how this is actually pronounced, but I'll just go with Chole because that's how I read it phonetically. And I don't know how the person does it. Anyway, Resident Evil Outbreak was way ahead of its time. So my plan is to, with the games, continue on ones that, I mean, I've got XCOM that I started new because it was redeemed, but if I'm going to a new game next with my own decision, I'll pick a sequel or one related to a series that I've already played to try and sort of finish those off for how much I want to play. We should do RE Outbreak at some point again. It would be fun. I remember some of the story as you mentioned it, but so much of it was, it's just fun playing with a mate rather than paying attention to the story. Plus you got all the different routes and scenarios and whatever, it's a bit like, oh, I don't know how to keep that straight. But anyway.
During the production of Resident Evil 2, series producer and director of the original game Shinji Mikami shared an idea with other members of the team. With the
thinking of, I'm gonna play the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 at one point especially. I think the Resident Evil 1 remake was true to the original a lot more, so I don't know if I'd play that, but 2 and 3 especially I'd want to play, I think.
Growing interest in online gaming in the late 90s, he suggested that the team try to make an online Resident Evil game in which players would work together as a team to survive. They tested out the idea by making a small multiplayer minigame where the players would try to survive for as long as possible, but since they couldn't come up with any creative ways to actually force the players to work together, everyone just ended up trying to fend for themselves the whole time, and the game supposedly became pretty boring pretty quickly. This led the team to the conclusion that what makes Resident Evil so scary was actually its lack of multiplayer, and the fact that players need to survive on their own without being able to rely on others, so they ultimately just scrapped the minigame and gave up on the idea. That is, until late 2001 at least. See, with the PlayStation 2 actually being capable of online network play, unlike the PlayStation 1 which only had system link functionality, Capcom decided to revive the—
I'm gonna hate those dogs when I play. I already hate the dogs in Resident Evil.
idea and use the research gathered from the first attempt to improve the overall experience. But interestingly, development of this title would be handled by Capcom's Production Studio 1 rather than Mikami's Studio 4. This was an interesting decision to say the least, as Production Studio 1 was primarily responsible for developing action and fighting games like Devil May Cry 2 and the Capcom vs. SNK series. The man assigned to direct this revived project would be Eiichiro Sasaki, and if that name sounds familiar to any of you, it's probably because he would later go on to direct everyone's favorite Resident Evil game. As far as we know, development from this point on actually went really smoothly, and Resident Evil Outbreak would eventually be released to the world in December of 2003. So would Outbreak manage to stick the landing and go down as a classic Resident Evil title, or would all the factors working against it end up ultimately holding it back? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 11th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but you'll definitely have some better context and probably get more enjoyment out of this video if you have seen the rest of them.
That could be something to have a look at later if he does a good job here.
So for those of you that are interested in checking out the others first, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Outbreak is a co-op survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 2 in 2003. And I know that right off the bat, a lot of you are going to be wondering how I went about playing this one, and answering that will conveniently also explain why there's been a nearly month-long gap between this and my last RE video. I decided that to get the proper Outbreak experience, I would need to play it with at least one friend along for the ride. So I reached out to my good friend and real-life anime woman False, who just so happens to be a huge horror game fan and a pretty big RE fan since childhood, much like myself. She had also never played either of the Outbreak games, so it was a pretty natural fit since we wouldn't have any sort of knowledge about the game that you otherwise wouldn't on a first playthrough. The only issue was that Outbreak's servers got taken down all the way back in 2007, so the only way to play the game online nowadays is by connecting to a fan server. Luckily though, thanks to some very dedicated members of the community, such a server does exist. The catch being that it's only compatible with Japanese copies of Outbreak. So if we wanted to play online, we had to mail order a couple of Japanese copies of the game, wait for them to arrive, and then dump them to PC so that we could patch them back into English and play them online through an emulator, since neither of us really wanted to mod our PS2s to be compatible with Japanese games.
Yeah. Oh, the less circuitous route, you don't necessarily would have to order them online.
So yeah, it was a bit of a process for us to get here,
not
but
the physical
thankfully
ones
False was
anyway.
more than willing to do all that to
We
help
did,
out with
yeah.
the video, and also just to play through the entire thing with me. So definitely go and show her some love on her channel.
Like, 2 players is more likely to be able to commit to actually playing through it all. Even if it's been a while.
That I'll have linked in the description below. Anyway, Resident Evil Outbreak takes place during the Raccoon City outbreak from Resident Evil 2 and 3. The game actually opens with the very beginnings of the outbreak, with our
Why do you keep standing in the way?
characters all just hanging out in a local bar when everything starts going to hell. From here, we get a variety of smaller scale scenarios that see us moving through certain areas of Raccoon City in our attempts to escape. The game even spans the entirety of the Raccoon City outbreak, with the final scenario on offer here ending just minutes before
Yeah, and then I was going to fire at the zombie and you were in the way.
the nuke from the end of RE3 hits the city. Due to the game's multiplayer nature though, it's very light on story, so much so that the various scenarios don't even take place in chronological order or really have any connective tissue whatsoever.
That's the tricky part to see how it all fits together
That being said though, for you Resident Evil lore heads out there are some dates and such scattered throughout the game that will allow you to still piece everything together on your own if you really want to. Just know that if you prefer a more direct form of storytelling, you're not going to get that here, as the team was clearly just concerned with making a strong co-op gameplay experience. At its core though, this is your pretty standard Resident Evil fare. The game uses tank controls and fixed camera angles, you run around looking for weapons, ammo, heals, and key items, and try to make those resources last long enough to ultimately find a way out of whatever awful situation you're stuck in. But as you might
like a lot of these areas I remember.
Imagine, the multiplayer nature of Outbreak ends up changing the experience by quite a bit. Since the designers understood that you'd be playing the game's various scenarios over and over again with your friends, they went ahead and randomized some of the item spawns to prevent players from just memorizing the entire thing and overly optimizing their runs. On top of that, the game also offers 5 unique difficulties ranging from very easy to very hard, and things like item placements and enemy spawns are changed around between each of these various difficulties, just adding another layer of randomization here. And to take that even further, the designers gave players a total of 8 unique playable characters to choose from, with each of them having their own unique abilities and statistics compared to the others. This was well above and beyond what they needed to do, since the game is only even playable with up to 4 players at any given time. So they easily could have just made 4 different characters and called it a day, but instead they gave you a total selection of 8. And
4? That's actually something notable, is that a bunch of multiplayer games now that are co-op only do have like 4 variations. It's a bit like FBC Firebreak. You have the 3 kids because there's 3 players at once. You don't have more options at the moment. I don't even remember what that was. I don't think I ever launched that separate game. Oh.
Their unique traits all make really big differences in how your scenario will play out. For example, most characters in this game only have 4 inventory slots to work with, but Yoko has a backpack that expands her inventory all the way to 8 slots. Some characters like Kevin or Mark not only get to start each scenario with a handgun already in their inventory, but their handguns are also stored in a special 5th slot that can't be used for anything else. So ultimately, they get to carry their handguns around for free without them taking up any space. And the biggest game changer here is probably Alyssa, who has a set of lockpicking tools that will occasionally grant access to lockers, drawers, or even entire
Hey,
rooms
that's
that wouldn't have been
Alyssa.
accessible
See,
otherwise.
I keep forgetting who's who in the names a bit and stuff. I forgot Alyssa was one of the player characters. I remembered she was in Outbreak, but I forgot what she did.
These always have great items in them too, like extra first aid sprays, shotguns, and even assault rifles if you're really lucky. Some scenarios will even have certain characters starting out in different locations from one another based on where they are in the introduction cutscene, which is a small but really nice touch to add a little more weight to your choice.
Yeah, I like that. It also gives the context of, oh, they were actually in a different place story-wise.
As choosing your favorite survivor will sometimes mean starting off your run separated from the rest of the team. And for that little cherry on top, each character typically gets their own unique intro and outro cutscene for every scenario as well, showcasing what your exact character is doing or thinking in that exact moment, while other players get to see what their character is doing or thinking as well. That's only a very brief description of half of the available characters, but it's more than enough to give those of you who have never played the game a good idea of just how big of a difference your character selections actually make here. To contrast the strong variety of the playable characters, though, there's the lack of variety in the game's scenarios. Not in the sense that these scenarios don't all feel meaningfully different from one another, because believe me, they do, but more in the sense that there just aren't very many to choose from. The final release of the game saw a total of 5 scenarios to choose from when playing, but allegedly, more than 2/3 of the game's originally planned scenarios were cut during development due to the game having a pretty rushed development cycle. Outbreak was originally meant to have a total of 18 different scenarios, complete with a large interconnected storyline to tie them all together, but the team ultimately had to cut it down to just the 5 I mentioned a second ago, as well as cutting the interconnected storyline, leaving the selection here feeling a bit limited. But
yeah, that would have helped it a lot. We were robbed as well, 18, plus all of the interconnected tissue between the stories would have been really awesome. Would have elevated it that step more.
Like I said just a minute ago, these scenarios are totally unique to one another.
Yeah, it's still connected, but you don't get as strong a connections as if they had the time to be able to tell the stories as deeply.
And all of them offer an entirely different experience to players. The game's first scenario will see you frantically escape.
A bit like he was saying earlier, you usually don't get the connected tissue unless you're like reading all the memos and piecing it together yourself.
From zombies during the initial chaos of the Raccoon City outbreak. But then the second is a much more slowly paced journey through the Umbrella Lab beneath the RPD. Then the third will see players trying to escape from Raccoon General Hospital while being chased down by an invincible stalker enemy. And the fourth will have you working your way through a hotel that's in the process of burning down, while also trying to sneak your way around a very large population of lickers. They all need to be approached in totally different ways, and even though there are only 5 scenarios, it is good to see that there's a high level of variety in the level design and the gameplay design between the 5 that we got.
Yeah, they picked well at having a variety.
That being said though, not all of these scenarios are totally enjoyable to play through. I personally loved the scenario in the burning hotel, as well as the final scenario set in Raccoon University, but I also personally hated the scenarios set in the hospital and the initial outbreak for reasons that we'll come back to soon. But what I think is really interesting here is that everyone who plays this game will have completely different preferences when it comes to these scenarios. False's opinions on these didn't even totally line up with mine, despite the fact that we played the entire thing together the whole way through, with her favorite being the underground lab, and with her least favorite also being the hospital scenario, because, well, it's shit. And I'm sure there are plenty of players out there who will love the initial outbreak scenario or hate the burning hotel one, because these are all ultimately going to come down to personal preference at the end of the day. And call me a big nerd all you want, but I personally love stuff like that in games because it leads to a lot of good discussion around what works in certain levels and what doesn't in
I remember the hospital was just so annoying.
others. And even though I might not like the hospital scenario very much,
especially with the whole chemical thing, like,
getting to revisit the hospital from RE3 in such higher fidelity was an awesome treat. And with me being the massive RE2 fanboy that I am, the same absolutely goes for the revisit to the underground lab from that game. Both of these areas are massively expanded as well, with both of them easily having double the real estate they did in their original appearances, if not triple, which makes them still feel really fresh to explore for longtime fans. It's some great nostalgia for fans of the classics like myself, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't start nerding out a bit when I would run into a room from RE2 that had been remade 1-to-1 here. And hopefully any of you who plan on playing Outbreak for yourself someday get that much enjoyment out of them too, because you'll be playing these scenarios a lot. Like, a whole lot. See, Resident Evil Outbreak is an incredibly punishing game. Since there would only be 5 scenarios in the full release, the developers were afraid that players would blast through all of the content and get bored of Outbreak rather quickly. So they went back to a tried and true method of stretching a game's value and runtime, that being just making the game really damn hard. Most of the scenarios are filled with continuous zombie spawns that will really put the pressure on players to move through environments quickly. If you stick in one area too long, you'll eventually run out of ammo from fighting off the never-ending zombies, and your team will be overrun. So the game forces players to be moving through everything as quickly as possible to ensure that they can find enough ammo and healing items to make it to the end of a scenario, which is something that I'm really not a fan of. Not entirely.
Yeah. So that's something that I'm not a big fan of either. I'd rather go, okay, the rooms and stuff may be difficult, but I'd like to, clear a room, take my time having a look around, then move on. Whereas the feeling rush is just a pain. And then you already have a timer, like he hasn't mentioned it yet, but you already have the timer with the infection percentage. So you can't stay in the scenario for too long or you'll eventually just fail it anyway.
Because I think that this alone is too difficult, because quite frankly, it's not. But more because it disrupts that careful balance that always made the classic Resi games so special to me. Anytime that you're met with an enemy in those games, you can run away from them to try to save some ammo, but at the risk of wasting a healing item if you get hit. Or you can use some of your ammo stockpile to put them down, which will then make the area a lot safer on return trips and ensure that those healing items can be saved for a potential boss fight later on. Having infinitely spawning enemies disrupts this balance a good deal, since you still have that careful balance.
That's a great point as well, because I haven't played the originals yet, but from playing the Resident Evil 1 remake, that makes a lot of sense too.
Ammo and healing items, but dropping an enemy will only actually make the area safe for about 15 seconds before a new one takes its place. Add on to this that every single scenario here has a boss fight at the end of it, and you have a recipe that ultimately results in killing enemies just not being worthwhile.
We played the bar. I remember the one where you go into the underground lab and that. I remember that train part where the bloody giant thing comes up, and I think I forget who it was out of us now. Yeah, he became a zombie in that. That was fun. Yeah, so I was trying to fight that solo. That's fun.
I mean, see.
And the it might have been Outbreak too that had some of the other levels I'm thinking of.
Seriously, False and I would rarely ever put an enemy down unless we absolutely had to here.
Because 1 and 2 sort of meld together with, they're essentially the same, but 2 added more things to them.
And even then, we would be completing those final boss fights with barely any ammo to spare. And to put even more pressure on players, the developers also gave zombies the ability to move between rooms as they please, which was definitely a surprising addition here.
I think that's a good addition. Like, if you don't deal with a zombie, it could end up in a different area. That is a nice thing for continuity between rooms as well. And that's a cool detail. But on top of there being the unlimited spawns in some areas, it's, the thing.
Zombies following players from one room to another isn't exactly a new thing for the series, as the RE1 remake actually already did that. But such encounters were all hard scripted and deliberately designed in that game. Here though, the zombies will legitimately just follow you around as you move through the scenario, once again forcing you into making the decision of either shooting them or just trying to continuously run away. And if it weren't for the infinite spawns, I definitely would have loved this inclusion here.
Yeah, that's the thing. If it wasn't for the infinite spawns.
But with the infinite spawns, it just felt like it was a bit too much at times and could lead to moments where we would be running away from a group of like 5 zombies in order to save our ammo for the upcoming boss fight. Now, there is an added mechanic here where a player can go and push themselves up against a door to prevent the zombies from breaking in, but
I don't remember that.
this will only hold them back for so long, and obviously the more zombies that are trying to come in, the faster they're going to break down the door regardless. And that's not the only way that Outbreak pushes players into moving through scenarios quickly, with the other mechanic pushing you to do so probably being my single least favorite thing about the entire game. That being the virus gauge.
Okay, so he doesn't like the virus gauge. Let's see what he says.
See, every player in Outbreak starts each scenario with a 0% infection rating, but as you spend more time in the city, that gauge will slowly start to fill, effectively putting a timer on each scenario, as reaching 100% infection will immediately kill the player. Each character has their own unique infection rate, so for example, playing as Kevin will give you a shorter timer than playing as David will. On top of that, any time that you take any form of damage, your infection rating will spike, bringing you ever closer to that instant game over. This, in my opinion, is the worst example of artificial difficulty in the game. I've been playing the Resident Evil games for nearly my entire life, and while I'm not the best player out there, I'm more than good enough at these games to play through entries like Code Veronica or RE0 for the first time in years with hardly any deaths during my entire run. If a player like me is given the time to slowly and carefully approach these games with little to no knowledge, it's easy enough for them to get through with barely any issue. But playing through Outbreak for the first time was absolutely brutal for us. Between the infinite enemy spawns that were almost constantly forcing us to keep running between rooms as quickly as possible, as well as a literal reset timer ticking down the entire time, False and I were rushed to figure things out as quickly as possible while we were still trying to learn how to play the game. Which of course led to tons of poor decisions being made along the way that would ultimately lead to us either dying from a lack of healing items or just running out of time. I mean, to put
some of that can be intentional, right? Where they go, oh, you're going to be playing this with friends and you can figure it out together. And it doesn't matter if you die, but you learn from the deaths and have a go next time and get better at it. That is something that if he's like, oh, he's had not many deaths in the games, that he can approach someone that. Is it a bad thing that one of them's a little more difficult? I'll let him finish his section on the infection count.
Put it into perspective, completing the game's 5 scenarios took us a little over 16 hours, which shows you just how much this artificial difficulty pads out the runtime of the game when you consider that a run of these will typically take 30 minutes to an hour apiece. And I get that this was made to be a co-op game and that the devs had to make the package feel worthwhile, but I don't think that making the normal difficulty this crushingly oppressive was the way to go about that. I mean, sure, hindsight is 20/20, but look at how arguably the best co-op game ever made, Left 4 Dead, handles it. You give players an entry point where they can feel challenged, but one where they can still reasonably get through a full run while they're getting to grips.
We should still play this, by the way, as well. I saw you play it a bit, and I've never played it before, so yeah.
With the game. Then, once they've had the chance to learn the game and really get into it, you can include some more challenging modes to give players that hardcore experience that they'll inevitably be looking for.
Yeah, okay, I see what he means here. So he would be more interested in the game easing you into it, whereas it feels more like you're thrown into the deep end with RE Outbreak. That makes sense. There are some parts of, like, the infection time was good. I thought it was a timer. The infection counter was good because you're rewarded for playing well. And also it makes you use your time effectively when you're playing and not just, oh, I'm gonna sit here in this room for a while before continuing on type thing. You actually still need to move around, and it makes you still move around a bit, and that I think the part that I'd agree on is the unlimited zombie spawns are probably the most annoying thing. The worst part about artificial difficulty, because the infection timer in that could have been balanced so that, infection counter, it's not exactly a timer. So that you efficiently go through places. You have to randomize loot and stuff and do the best you can with what you have, rather than making it unlimited. I think they could have led to some cool play style things and strategy. And also, later on, they could have introduced something, or on easy mode or whatever, introduce some things that lower the infection rate or slow it down so that you have more time. Anyway.
One of my biggest pet peeves in gaming is when it feels like my time is being intentionally wasted, and with each of Outbreak's scenarios taking a solid few tries to get through since you basically just need to learn the layout and the routes ahead of time, it absolutely made me feel like it was just padding itself out at the expense of my patience. It's one thing for a game to be hard, but it's another thing entirely for a game to add mechanics or systems to an established formula with the sole intention of making the game take longer to complete. And unfortunately, Outbreak has a couple of those systems itself.
So yeah, I think it could be improved upon, but some of the stuff there I do like.
Okay, so with that admittedly emotional rant out of the way, I should really emphasize that there's still plenty to love about Resident Evil Outbreak. I'm sure I lost a few
Oh, you can kill it with the train? The more you know.
of you during all that rambling, but I really didn't want to end the video on such a negative note. So for those of you that did somehow stick through it, let's talk about what makes Outbreak so awesome. The biggest thing that I somehow haven't called attention to yet is just how ahead of its time this game's multiplayer actually was. I mean, seriously, once you're logged into the game's servers, you can simply just head over to the server browser and create a room for you and your friends to play in. You can set how many players you want to allow in the lobby, set a password so that no one you don't want to join can actually join, and then play through the entire game from beginning to end with your friends. This all might sound really normal nowadays, but that's kind of my point. This was a PS2 exclusive released in 2003, and yet it uses a server browser system that is exactly what we still use for numerous PC games more than 20 years later. Beyond that, the game also works within its limitations to facilitate cooperation between players. Aside from just needing to coordinate things like inventory management and who has what key item, there are also some additional mechanics that will push players into sticking together and working as a team. The first of these is what the game calls the ad-lib system. This is a neat little addition where you can activate certain preset voice lines for your character by pointing the right thumbstick in a specific direction. These lines will be things like telling someone to follow you, calling for help, and just other basic voice shouts that you might need to communicate with other players. This
gives a simple way of not needing voice chat. That's neat.
Obviously goes a super long way to facilitate communication between players prior to consoles having built-in voice chat systems like they do nowadays. It's something that can easily be taken for granted when playing the game nowadays and using something like Discord the way False and I did, but back then, this would have been a really big deal. Then there's the new bleeding mechanic that can randomly be triggered whenever you take some damage. If a player starts bleeding, they'll go into this extremely slow limping state in which even the basic zombies will be moving around the room faster than you are. This obviously leaves you open to a pretty swift death if you start bleeding with no one else around, but if other players are nearby, they can actually grab you and quickly pull you away to safety. And if they don't want to do that, they can of course just kill whatever enemy was about to turn you into their dinner and buy you some time to heal up and get moving again. And then of course, there's the down state the players will enter if they die to an enemy. As you might expect, a teammate can obviously go over to these players and pick them up to prevent them from dying and being unable to continue playing the scenario. But the way that the designers went about making a downed player an urgent priority is actually pretty interesting. When you go down an Outbreak, rather than getting a generic bleed out timer, your virus gauge will actually start to fill up incredibly quickly.
While he said he didn't like the virus gauge, that's a great way to use it.
So if you already have a high virus gauge when you go down, you won't be able to remain in this down state for long before fully dying out. And regardless of how full your virus gauge was when you went down, the longer you remained in the down state, the shorter your death timer will be for the entire rest of the run once you do get up. So as you can probably imagine, if a teammate goes down in Outbreak, you'll need to basically drop whatever you're doing to get them back up as quickly as possible. It's another really clever way of pushing players to stick together and work as a team, because while you can just have everyone split up and go complete different objectives to try to speedrun the scenario, you run a considerable risk by having everyone separated like that. Oh, and I left this fun twist for when I talked about going down and bleeding out, but if a player's virus gauge actually hits 100%, they don't necessarily just die. Instead, your character will turn into a zombie, and you'll be able to control that zombie to go and take your teammates down with you. You obviously don't have to go and kill your teammates when you turn, as you're still perfectly in control of your character, but if I'm not finishing this scenario, then no one is finishing this scenario. It's just another one of those little additions that, while not entirely necessary, does just make Outbreak feel a little more special by being there.
I also love when games give whoever dies something to do still, compared to when, oh, you died, but someone's continuing on and you can't keep going. That's a great way to do that.
Overall, though, Resident Evil Outbreak is a game that I have some very mixed feelings on. The artificial difficulty frustrated the hell out of me, but I'm sure that this is a little less frustrating each time you go back to replay the game, since simply knowing your way around the scenarios and mechanics goes a really long way here. And I mean, come on guys, it's a classic style Resident Evil game that you can play through with up to 3 of your friends. How could I ever not like Outbreak with a concept like that? I may not totally agree with every part of its execution, but it's just such a cool idea, and getting to play through it with a friend was really awesome, even if I needed a little time to cool off after every few hours of playing. The fact that this game can still feel so much like classic Resident Evil despite being built around co-op play is really incredible, and I seriously hope that there's some sort of official re-release or remaster someday that will make this one a lot easier for fans to get into. It might be far from my favorite game that we've covered in the series so far, but it's definitely one of the coolest, and one that I wish more players could get the chance to properly experience. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Outbreak a 7.1. Hey guys, thanks for making it all the way through another video. If you enjoyed it, consider throwing a quick like or a sub my way to help out with that whole algorithm thing. We are going into January after all, so it's probably going to be kicking my ass here pretty soon. And while you're at it, don't forget to go and check out False's channels and show her some love for helping to make this video possible. As always, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and
did we see a video of his before? I forget. But I'm gonna have a look. I haven't played Revelations yet. That's one of the ones that have been in the list for a while. But I'm actually wondering if he did Outbreak too. There's the Outbreak video, yeah. There it is. I might put that on for another time. Because hearing about... Oh, I could watch it next. But I'll put it on the playlist. Because hearing his thoughts about Outbreak 1 and then Outbreak 2 would be good.
YouTube memberships. You guys really do add some much needed stability to these long-running series, and I can't thank you enough for that. But with all the thank yous and begging for likes out of the way, I'm going to let you guys go and get back to working on the next video. So thank you all again for watching.
I'm kind of interested in this now, but we started with Resi 1, 2, 3. Okay, yeah. That'll be interesting to go have a listen to holistically as well. That's neat. I might as well watch that second one now. I'll just reload this so that I have the video here on the playlist.
After the surprising...
So, it'll be interesting to see how he liked file number 2 compared to the first game.
Success of Resident Evil Outbreak, Capcom quickly saw the potential of this little co-op survival horror spin-off. I mentioned in my video talking about the original Outbreak that the game had more than 2/3 of its original content cut before release, and this is where Capcom knew that they could cash in on the unexpected success of the title. A couple months after the game's release, they went back to the team at Production Studio 1 and asked them if they could polish up and finish work on some of the unreleased scenarios from the first game so that they could be released as a standalone sequel. The men and women of Production Studio 1 were completely on board with the idea, with many of them naturally wanting to go back and finish a lot of that content that they had put so much time and effort into so that they could share it with the rest of the world. And since a lot of this work was already pretty far along by the time they had decided to make the sequel, Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 would be released to the world in September of 2004, less than 9 months after the release of the original.
Yeah, that was quick.
So would Outbreak File 2 manage to meaningfully build upon its predecessor to create the ultimate co-op survival horror experience, or would it fall victim to many of the original's issues? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 12th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I definitely recommend that you've at least seen my video on the first Outbreak game first, so that you can get a better understanding of how that game works and the context surrounding its release. So for those of you that are interested, I'll have the link to the full series in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first.
I'm interested to see how well Resident Evil runs for the GOG versions of the good old games as well, anyway.
But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 is a standalone expansion for Resident Evil Outbreak developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 2 in 2004. And I'm sure a lot of you are wondering why I've split these games into 2 separate videos, since most people typically just lump them
together. But the good old games on GOG label is meant to say that it'll run smoothly on modern computers and stuff. So it's ported and things are polished up. Where would it be if I go to installed? Hey, the first Resident Evil. Hang on. Close, just silly. I didn't want to go there. Bloody thing. Because, no, just, yeah, here. I thought I'd play the original Resident Evil as well, I think, when I was playing the originals. Where was it? Anyway, the label is supposed to mean that they've polished it up and ported it a bit. Oh, can it? As far as I know. Them bringing it here, yeah, good old game, them modern preserving games, yeah. Best experience available for the games on the market. And the game will work on current and future most popular Windows PC configurations. Best version of the game you can buy on PC, and they have tech support. It would be really cool to see Outbreak on GOG, actually, if they manage to have tech support and host servers that aren't as convoluted as, or not as many steps to do as no. Anyway. That's the Resident Evil ones on GOG at the moment, but Outbreak would be great if they could have servers up for it as well.
Together. But I think you'll see as we go along that File 2 definitely does enough to deserve its own dedicated video in this series, even if it might be a bit of a shorter video than most. And much like my video on the first game, my good friend False was generous enough to sit down and play through this entire thing with me so that we could get the proper co-op experience. Yeah. So just like what I talked about back then, make sure to go and check her channels out and show her some love for helping out. With all the preamble out of the way though, what is Outbreak File 2? Well, like I said before, it's a standalone expansion for the first Outbreak game, meaning that while it largely reuses the original game's core gameplay, all of the content here is completely new. And the standalone part comes from the fact that you don't have to own the first game and have played that first in order to play File 2, but it's definitely a better and more complete experience if you have. To start though, the game features 5 entirely new scenarios for players to play through,
5,
all of which were
okay.
ones that got cut during the production of the first Outbreak game.
Mhm.
So if you already owned a copy of the original, purchasing a copy of File 2 would quite literally double the amount of Outbreak content you had available to you.
And they called it file number 2, which is great.
These scenarios all see the same group of survivors from Outbreak 1 escaping from the Raccoon City incident, but much like the first game, there isn't much of a story here. Once again, each scenario basically acts as its own little mini story, and there are little bits of lore scattered throughout for those who really want to get every last detail here.
Yeah.
But there isn't any sort of overarching storyline that connects each individual scenario. This is still perfectly fine by me, as it's clear that the developers just wanted to make the best multiplayer experience possible, but I feel like it's at least worth mentioning that this would have been the perfect opportunity.
I'll just pull it up because I have the dream list or whatever. I can chuck to the side, there we go.
To try to flesh out the story of Outbreak just a little bit more. It would have been really nice to see them add a more satisfying narrative through line here, and they probably could have retroactively tied things into the first game scenarios well enough to add some context to those as well. That being said, the first game didn't have much of a story, so in my opinion, it's not really worth complaining that the second one doesn't either. Fans of the original would already know what to expect going in, so this wouldn't really be much of an issue. One thing that I absolutely loved about File 2's scenarios is just how much more varied they are than the scenarios in Outbreak 1 were, and also just how much better they play than them.
There's an update for
Don't get me
Galaxy
wrong,
of
Outbreak
Course
1
series.
already had some solid variety in its scenarios, but File 2's scenarios just feel much more creative and unique by comparison.
Yeah, these areas I remember a bit. We should finish Outbreak 2. Yeah, we should do the whole thing. Maybe we can stream it and then we can both be on voice chat and have a good time with it. But we should do that together then. See if we can do that.
To give those of you who haven't played File 2 a solid idea, the first scenario in the game takes place in the Raccoon City Zoo and sees players fighting off a large variety of T-virus infected animals while being chased around the map by a giant zombie elephant. The second feels much more similar to an Outbreak 1 scenario, with it being set in the Raccoon City subway system and seeing players trying to reactivate the trains so they can make their escape. But then the third scenario has players running around the Arklay Mountains woods until they eventually come across an abandoned hospital where they're then chased around by a murderous Axeman while trying to find a way to destroy a giant T-virus infected plant. Then the fourth sees players returning to the RPD from RE2, and the fifth has us running around inside a secret Umbrella lab, fighting hunters alongside a friendly tyrant. So as you can see, the variety and the gimmicks in the scenarios here are absolutely S tier. And like I mentioned before, not only are these scenarios just conceptually more exciting, but they're also incredibly well executed. In Outbreak 1, I would say that I loved 2 of the game's 5 scenarios, felt like one of them was just okay, and actively disliked the other 2. Here in File 2 though, I loved 4 of the game's 5 scenarios, and thought that the remaining one was good, but just not one that I would want to play over and over again. Which, for the record, because I know some people will be wondering, that one was the final scenario in the Umbrella Lab for me, purely because it just felt like it was a bit too linear and played pretty much the exact same way every time we ran through it. It's still really cool, but it's just not one that I would want to play over and over. It's hard to describe, but it felt like the scenarios here had much stronger level design, much better pacing, and also just a lot more love poured into them than the first games did. I mean, seriously, the amount of...
They probably had them virtually done so they could spend more time on them too, which is the main thing there.
Enemy variety alone really just goes to show how much they wanted each scenario to feel special here. Every single scenario, aside from the RPD, has at least 1 or 2 unique enemies that were made just to fit the setting and theme of that specific scenario. And the RPD just uses iconic enemies from RE2 because nostalgia is one hell of a drug. On top of that, 3 of this game's 5 scenarios have multiple paths to completion and multiple unique endings for players to discover, whereas Outbreak 1 only had branching pathways like this in its final scenario. Now, that being said, no scenario here is totally perfect, and there are still some annoying spots where you'll have to deal with things like infinite zombie spawns and just other things that really rubbed me the wrong way in the first game. But I do have to say that these moments feel much more few and far between here. The scenarios of File 2 just felt much more intuitive, well-paced, and most importantly, fair compared to what we saw in the first game. And both myself and False felt like this made File 2 a lot easier to just hop on and play than the original was.
Yeah, I think we found that it was more enjoyable generally, which is good.
But the scenarios aren't the only place where we see massive improvements in File 2, because they've also improved the overall game mechanics quite a bit here. Something that players familiar with Outbreak 1 will immediately realize is that every character now has an extra item in their inventory at the beginning of each scenario, with each of these new items further cementing each character's role in the overall sandbox. Kevin and Mark no longer start with just their pistols in their inventory, but they now also start with a loaded magazine for their respective pistols, meaning they're immediately able to start clearing zombies out to make things easier for other players. George used to start with just a medical kit that would allow him to turn herbs into medicines, but he now also starts with a capsule shooter that allows him to fire those medicines at his allies to heal them.
Yeah, I think they added some extra things which are cool.
And as a nice little bonus, every pill that you shoot out of this capsule shooter will now have its effects magnified as well. Yoko's backpack already made her one of the most useful characters in Outbreak 1, but she now also starts each scenario with a charm that reduces her infection rate by 30%, with her even being able to hand this charm off to other players to slow their infection rate down instead. This made Yoko so good in File 2 that I don't think False and I really ever even played without her on any of our runs, because say I wanted to play someone with a higher infection rate like Kevin. If she then played Yoko, she would have double the inventory space and could also just hand the charm over to me, and we would have way more time to explore and figure out how to get through the scenario. I could sit here and tell you about how every single character's extra item expands their importance in gameplay, but I think that those examples already give you guys a great idea of just how small yet impactful this addition really is. And that's only the first of a number of meaningful gameplay improvements. Another huge improvement for me, and for anyone else who's just getting into Outbreak for the first time, is that the virus gauge fills more slowly here in File 2. It's not gone entirely, so it does still force you to move quickly through scenarios, but it's been made a little more lenient so that newer players can get to grips with the game more easily. It made it way easier for False and I to get through the game's various scenarios in only 1 or 2 attempts each, and just generally makes the game a lot more enjoyable for those of us who haven't poured tens, if not hundreds of hours into these games already. Additionally, I'm not entirely sure about this one, but it seemed like there were a lot more healing items placed around the game's various scenarios.
Yeah, it makes it better. It's more friendly. It's not as bad. Yeah, Outbreak 3 being cancelled is sad. They could still make it, and it'd go well, I reckon. But I don't think they want to stray from the tank controls and that, which they want to do with the remake. So I would hope they would keep it to...
And since using a
you choose the difficulty you
healing
play
item
on.
in Outbreak temporarily freezes your virus gauge as well as giving you back some of your health, it's definitely more beginner friendly than the first game. And an amazing addition here is that there's now a training course in the single player mode that will teach you how to actually play Outbreak. But even with that increased forgiveness for new players, it's still a game that can be plenty challenging on the higher difficulties, and they even added a new Nightmare mode to offer an even greater challenge for Outbreak veterans. Nightmare mode can be applied to any difficulty, and it reduces the effectiveness of all healing items by 25%, as well as increasing enemy damage by 30%. So for those of you that are looking for the most difficult Outbreak experience possible, stacking the Nightmare mode on top of the very hard difficulty will give you exactly that. Something that I actually forgot to talk about in my first Outbreak video was the fact that every character in this game has at least one unique ability they can use. Some characters are capable of executing what's known as a pot shot, where they enter a special stance when using pistols for increased damage, and others are capable of dodging enemy attacks or tackling zombies to push them out of the way. These don't typically make a massive difference in your average playthrough, but they can be super helpful from time to time, and they've also gotten a bit of polish here. To start, they added some new abilities to certain characters that just weren't available in the original, and some abilities like Alyssa's dodge feel noticeably smoother here in File 2. They're improved to the point where I feel like going back to Outbreak 1 and playing some of my favorite characters like Alyssa would feel sort of janky by comparison, and it's another thing that just made me enjoy my time with File 2 that much more.
Improvements.
Okay, so pausing the video real quick for a quick unscripted ramble because I just realized that something was in the game that I didn't know about until right at the end of editing the entire video. While editing, I found this random little clip of False actually walking while shooting an assault rifle, and it made me realize that there's a crazy new feature here that I didn't even know about. It turns out that Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 is actually the first game in the entire franchise where you can move while shooting. This applies to other weapons in the game too, like melee weapons where you can walk around and then just take a quick pause to swing, but as long as it's a firearm in File 2, you can actually walk around while shooting. And I wish that we knew about this sooner because as it turns out, being able to walk while shooting is kind of overpowered here since the entire Outbreak experience is built on the old system where you have to stand still.
Well, we know how to make the game a lot easier too now, is just walk while you're shooting.
The impression that walking while shooting comes much later in the series, but as it turns out, it's right here. Alright, enough yapping, now back to the actual scripted part. And last but not least, File 2 also massively expands the bonus content. The original had a bunch of different character skins and even secret characters that you could unlock by beating certain challenges, and File 2 continues that tradition while also offering way more unlockable content than Outbreak 1. Additionally, there's a couple of entirely new game modes here, with the first of these being the new Elimination mode. In Elimination mode, you and your team will be spawned into a room from one of the existing scenarios and be given a 30-minute time limit to clear the map of all enemies. As you go through your first door though, you'll quickly notice that these maps are a disorienting mishmash of reused rooms from scenarios of both Outbreak 1 and 2. So you might spawn in the university scenario from the first game, but then when you go through a door, you'll suddenly be in the halls of the RPD. I wasn't really a fan of this mode as it felt pretty confusing in terms of layout thanks to the dimension shifting doors, and just kind of boring since all you're doing is searching for zombies and then shooting them once you find them. I'm sure there's someone out there who loves this mode, but it's just not really my thing. In a similar vein, there's Showdown mode. In Showdown mode, you'll load into a random boss fight from one of the two games, and after you defeat that boss, you'll be brought straight into another one. This cycle will then repeat a few times until you either die or just clear out all the bosses for that run. This one is definitely a bit cooler since boss rush modes are just really fun, and it does let you relive some of the bosses from Outbreak 1 with all the small improvements of File 2. That being said though, it's still a really simple addition that most people probably won't care about. It's definitely cool that it's here, but I just know that I personally won't be revisiting this or the Elimination mode anytime soon. To wrap up this short little review though, I have to say that I enjoyed my time with Outbreak File 2 much more than I did my time with the first. It's basically just everything that already made Outbreak so damn cool, but polished up a good bit and without a single bad scenario in its lineup. The game is also much more forgiving to newer players like myself, but still offers those higher difficulties for experienced players who will be looking for a challenge. Now, of course, some of that might have just been that False and I were more prepared going into this one after already completing the original, so new players shouldn't expect that there won't be any struggle. But I definitely don't think it would be as hard to learn the game in File 2 as it was in File 1. Overall, I would say that Outbreak File 2 really is the ultimate co-op survival horror experience on the market. The original laid the foundations, but File 2 truly brings it all together in a satisfying way. I'm sure that the team could have improved the formula even more going forward, but unfortunately, this would be the last Outbreak title we ever received. I have no doubt that Capcom would have wanted to release some of the remaining 8 scenarios that we never saw if this were a success, but as far as the published sales data reveals to us, File 2 only sold about 200,000 copies. Which, when compared to Outbreak 1's nearly 1.5 million copies sold, you can see why Capcom quickly lost faith in the potential growth of the Outbreak brand.
Yeah. Interesting. And how businesses only look at those numbers as well.
It's really unfortunate because it feels like File 2 was just really starting to hit its stride, and I would have loved to see them polish up this little gem even more over time. But as much as I hate to say it, it does make total sense why Capcom wouldn't want to risk funding another title. Maybe someday Capcom will gain the confidence they need to give us an entirely new Outbreak experience, but until that day, we at least have Outbreak 1 and 2 to look back on as some of the coolest Resident Evil spin-offs ever released. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Outbreak File 2 an 8.1. Hey guys.
I think that's the main bit, yeah. No, that's neat. Imagine what they could do now as well. They could have all 18 scenarios in a Resident Evil Outbreak 3, polish up a lot of it, improve it, and then have Resident Evil Outbreak collected files or something like that. And you can play through all of the scenarios from the first couple of games plus new scenarios as well. And there'd be like a chronological look. Did you pay attention during the game showcases? There were a few games that are actually in retro pixel art style and stuff, so this could come back, this style. Honestly, it seems like what Resident Evil fans like a lot too is the tank controls in this style. And it does feel so much more Resident Evil to me than not. There's something about it, like Resident Evil 5 and 6 changed a bit too, Resident Evil. But like the early Resident Evil, like Resident Evil 1 and that, feel much closer. Well, they can get some indie developer to make Resident Evil Outbreak 3. Give it to an indie developer. They could probably do it, and then it wouldn't cost them as much either if they got an indie guy to do it.